Hello, my YouTube listeners. This is a short clip from a message I'm preparing for my July release on my Patreon site. When I finish this series, I'm planning to render this material into a book and make that available to my Patreon subscribers for free. But anyway, let me begin with a small clip from my July message. In this segment of our study on historicism and Bible interpretation, I'll be covering the doctrine of the first resurrection, as taught primarily by Jesus Christ and supported in certain epistles. My primary purpose is to help Bible students evaluate the significance of the first resurrection and decide for themselves which schools of prophetic interpretation most closely align with what the Bible actually teaches. This is primarily an exegetical study and not meant to be a detailed comparison of historicism, preterism, and futurism regarding the doctrine of the first resurrection, though surely I will touch on some of the problems raised when examining the implications of the first resurrection as taught by Jesus. Let us begin by turning in our King James Bibles to John chapter 6, starting with verses 39, 40, 44, and 54. Verse 39 reads, "And this is the Father's will which hath sent me, that of all things that he has given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day." Then verse 40 clarifies that Jesus is referring to the resurrection of believers at the last day. That verse reads as follows, "And this is the will of him that sent me, that every one which seeth the Son, and believeth on him, may have everlasting life. And I will raise him up at the last day." Then verse 44 says, "No man can come to me except the Father which hath sent me draw him, and I will raise him up at the last day." And verse 54 reads, "Whoso eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day." Thus we find Jesus confirming 4 times that there will be a resurrection of believers at the last day. There are 2 primary questions begged by these verses. They are, number 1, is this a spiritual resurrection or a bodily resurrection? And number 2, what is the last day? When is it? I think the first question is easily answered by the resurrection and ascension of Christ, who appeared in physical form to his disciples, ate with them, and ascended into heaven in a physical form, as described in Acts chapter 1. Romans chapter 8, verse 29 confirms that Christ is the firstborn of many brethren, and that we as believers will be conformed to his image. That verse reads, "For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren." This idea that believers will be resurrected, as was Christ, is also mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 and 23. I won't turn to those verses right now. However, for your own study, I recommend that you do that on your own. I think most Bible students will come to the conclusion that Jesus is speaking of a bodily resurrection at a particular point in time. And that brings us to the second question. That is, what is the last day that Jesus speaks of? We must ask the question, the last day of what? This question is best answered by examining Revelation chapter 20, where a first and a second resurrection are discussed. The Bible teaches only 2 general resurrections. The first is the resurrection of believers, and the second, the resurrection of the damned. Verses 5 and 6 of Revelation chapter 20 describe the first resurrection that happens prior to a 1,000-year reign of Christ. Only believers are resurrected in the first